Now we'll begin our first debate of the term. This House believes the Commonwealth should have no future, and I look to Daniel Dipper, Magdalen College, elected member of Standing Committee, to open the case for the proposition.
Good evening and welcome to the first debate of the term. I firstly wanted to thank Madam President for providing me with this wonderful opportunity. It's a rare one indeed, actually, because it's going to make my degree look useful for at least 5 minutes, so I'm glad I'm getting my money's worth. So to me, the only way you can understand the Commonwealth, what it is, why it exists, and most importantly for tonight, why it should have no future, is through a historical lens. Empire is intrinsically linked to Commonwealth, and its legacies must not be ignored or forgotten. I hope in the next few minutes to sensitively and critically examine some of the theories that were used in the 19th century to justify empire, to explain why we should see this as a form of neo-colonialism. From ideas of Greater Britain and descriptions of empire as a commonwealth of nations, to theories of empire for so-called altruism purposes, we can still see remnants of these within the Commonwealth today, which fatally undermine any attempts, as it says, to promote prosperity, democracy and peace, amplify the voice of small states, and protect the environment, which, as I say, the Commonwealth is supposed to fulfill. So, first of all, promoting prosperity, when many of these countries suffer from structural economic issues due to Britain having extraction colonies in the 19th century for the purposes of economic development. Democracy and peace, when empire hollowed out functioning governance systems and only decreased violence because of harsh enforcement. Amplifying the voice of small states, when empire tried to crush challenge and autonomy. Protecting the environment, when untold damage was wreaked by the extraction of materials from the earth for ever-accelerating industrialisation, with the UK on its own estimated to be responsible for over 4.5% of all additional carbon in the atmosphere from 1750 until the present day. The mantras of Commonwealth simply do not hold true, and the fact that Britain has believed at any point it has credibility in these areas to be working with other countries on this is simply astonishing. But first, it falls on me to introduce the speakers for the opposition tonight. You'll firstly hear from Gia Chadha, the current Women's Officer at the Union. Given Wadham's reputation for progressivism and inclusion, I'm very much looking forward to hearing how progressive Commonwealth really is. Our second speaker tonight is the Right Honourable the Lord Marland, Chairman of the Commonwealth Enterprise and Investment Council. Given the Honourable Speaker has served as a Minister for the Department of Energy and Climate Change, I look forward to hearing him expound the benefits of the Commonwealth and Britain in energy, given one of the longest lasting legacies from the 19th century is a planet warming to an extent it could fry us all. And finally, closing the case for the opposition will be the Right Honourable the Lord Boating, PC, a civil rights lawyer who previously served as the British High Commissioner to South Africa. Having been a Minister for Young People, it is rather surprising to see the Honourable Member on the other side of the House, given young people's drive for education on empire and some of the more problematic aspects of British history. I hope the vote later tonight will affirm this view. These are your speakers, Madam President, and they are most welcome. In 1868, Charles Wentworth Dilke published a travellogue called Greater Britain, a record of travel in English-speaking countries during 1866 to 67. Later picked up by the imperial historian and political essayist John Robert Seeley in 1883, the concept of Greater Britain was meant to symbolise the unity of the colonies with the colonising power being one part of a greater whole. Yet, even this term, one meant to emphasise homogeneity, was delineated by suggestions India was part of some separate Greater Britain. Seeley argued India could not be part of the same Greater Britain as other countries which were titled white settler colonies because of race. So even when similarities were trying to be emphasised with vocabulary, race was ever present, and the fact that race was being used to discriminate against people from other countries is a gross understatement. Another theory that I want to raise, which I believe to be relevant to the debate in question tonight, is how imperialists themselves spoke about and justified empire. Many commentators in the 19th century did not theorise the expansion of empire's destiny, some form of manifest destiny, but rather as accidental and incremental. While some simply wanted empire for personal gain, others in demeaning and cruel terms saw it as some form of reluctant duty to civilise parts of the world simply because they had different ways of organising society than the UK. Missionaries were sent to try to change the religion of individuals and communities, And even when some governance capacities began to be devolved in the 20th century to individual countries, British officials were still generally in positions of responsibility, both because of a lack of trust in staff from the colonies and more deeply because of racial stereotypes that self-government had to be learnt rather than something which could be led by and adapted by individual host nations. In moments in the past when those from all countries in the empire were involved, for example in World War I as soldiers not from the UK were generally made to feel unwelcome after the war, and divisions between home and abroad became reformulated. The reason I've detailed these theories is because I believe them eminently important to the Commonwealth and the debate in question tonight. This idea of altruism, needing a country which has been labelled more developed to lead others, and this sense of power imbalance remains in place today. In the news, when a country who's previously dominated by Britain makes a decision which is not seen as in British interest, it is wholeheartedly condemned by Britain. So how can the Commonwealth exist when the relationship which built its base has remained the same for 200 years in some respects? Through Western financial institutions, financial practices, including neoliberalism, are directly applied to former colonies in a way that exerts control, which we could label as neocolonialism. The term Commonwealth was even used in the 19th century to refer to the countries in the orbit of the British Empire. So the reasons why I am arguing that the Commonwealth should have no future is because of these links that I've just briefly outlined for tonight, which I hope our speakers will further espouse. Indeed, there are some interesting points which I hadn't considered before. I believe that in some respects, I suppose, yes, but at the same time, we do need some form of organisation between countries. However, does that have to be the colonising power with former colonised countries that were within the sphere of control of that country? I'm not so sure. Whereas some of these other organisations, NATO, for example, is across Europe, across empires, different powers, and therefore I'd argue in some respects it's slightly different because there was not quite the same power imbalance that was evident in the empire, which I believe is still partially present in the Commonwealth today. But thank you for your point of information. It's a very interesting thought, which, well, I hadn't thought about before and I've certainly reflected on. So I think that returning back to the arguments that I've briefly made, I think that Greater Britain, an empire being developed as some form of altruism, clearly highlights how the Commonwealth is still in some ways based on imperial ideas and concepts. Countries suffering with slower economic growth was caused from longer term issues resulting from the financial institutions being set up to solve the purposes of empire. Democracy and peace was disrupted by violence and imposition from Britain. Institutions dominated by London, even when self-government began to be granted due to racial assumptions and the environment whose responsibility really does truly lie with Britain. These are all key issues the Commonwealth are meant to work together to resolve, but issues that Britain created and frankly Britain is not doing enough to tackle. The Commonwealth should have no future because it is clearly based on the past. Thank you.